Hi everyone, my name is Connor Mee, and today I will be presenting my research on the terminology development as a component of Inuktitut language planning. Just as a note, I am still presenting preliminary results and interpretations as this research project is still in progress and I'm still uh, collecting data and I have a lot of data to keep analyzing. However, I would just like to come here and share the results and findings that I currently have regarding this project. So as an introduction, I would first like to start by giving a bit of linguistic context on the language Inuktitut. Inuktitut is an Inuit-Yupik Unangan language native to the indigenous Inuit people of the central and eastern Canadian Arctic. In the modern day, with Inuktitut and English in uh, provinces of Canada, such as Nunavut, where Inuktitut is more widely spoken, we see somewhat of a bilingual situation, as both English and Inuktitut are the official languages of some Canadian territories, such as Nunavut. However, Inuktitut as the mother tongue is generally used as the main language in home life and traditional activities. Both English and Inuktitut are used in community interactions, such as in social and workplace contexts. However, we do see somewhat of an asymmetrical situation here where English as the prestige dialect is more often used as the main language in professional services and schooling. So then here within Inuktitut language planning, there is lots of effort being dedicated towards terminology development in Inuktitut. There are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, there is a functional necessity for terminology development in modern contexts, as we're seeing some domain gaps, for example, in modern fields such as law and healthcare, which require more precise terminology to ensure access to services in Inuktitut and to be able to communicate within these domains in Inuktitut. And secondly, this also helps to counteract language shift, as English currently, as I already mentioned with this asymmetric language situation, often dominates in professional settings, workplaces, and online. So then terminology development helps to maintain Inuktitut use within some more specialized domains. So then essentially, my research is within terminology development as a component of lexical expansion within this language planning process. Two research questions that I set out to research and explore were firstly, what lexical innovation strategies are employed in Inuktitut terminology development? So essentially, uh, during this terminology development process, how are these people creating new words? How are they creating new terms and new terminology to reflect these ideas in the specialized domains? And secondly, how are language ideologies reflected in the terminological development of Inuktitut? So essentially, through these lexical innovation strategies, through other aspects that we observe within this terminological development, how do we see language ideologies within the language planning process manifest itself? Okay, now I'd like to just quickly go over some of the methodology used in this project. It was mainly a document-based qualitative and quantitative analysis. So essentially, I gathered 13 official Inuktitut English glossaries and conducted a qualitative and quantitative analysis on them. These 13 Inuktitut English glossaries that contain the corpus were official, so they were official language planning documents. They were made during language planning workshops carried out by Inuit elders from across Nunavut, Inuktitut language specialists, and subject specialists. So essentially, they are a great reflection of this official terminology development process. And within this corpus, we had glossaries from various fields, such as legal, medical, and environmental terms. So we have representation from developed terminology in various fields. And approximately, there's a few thousand terms that have been gathered through this corpus. I also analyzed document paratexts such as prefaces, other texts within the document to try to analyze and see if there are any language ideologies that are being reflected in these texts. Then I categorize these lexical strategies according to the theoretical framework of Institute Lexical Innovation proposed by Dore, Louis-Jacques Dore. And then I quantified the frequency per domain, the frequency of appearances of different lexical strategies. And then I conducted an analysis of data to try to find general patterns, as well as see if we can see any any language ideologies manifest within this process. For example, maybe linguistic purism. Okay, so now on to the findings. First of all, I'll just be kind of responding to my first research question, which was about what type of lexical innovation strategies are being observed within terminology development. Through this analysis, I employed Doris' theoretical framework of Inuktitut lexical innovation. And all three types of lexical innovation that he identified were types of lexical innovation that I was able to identify within this terminology from the corpus. So first of all, we have lexicalization, which is essentially creating new words from existing Inuktitut roots and affixes. For example, we have the English word bylaw, which was in one of the terminology glossaries, and then the Inuktitut term for this that they developed was maligagalak, which is lexicalization because they took a native Inuktitut root, maligak, meaning law, and then they added an adjective affix, halak, meaning small, to literally mean small law. And secondly, we also had examples of semantic loan, which Doré refers to this as changement de sens, so essentially, literally a change of meaning. So basically, in this method, existing words from Inuktitut existing native terms take on new meanings. For example, in one of the corpuses, for the English word bill, the Inuktitut term for this was also maligak, which originally means law, but through semantic loan, it now also means bill. And thirdly, we also have borrowing, so basically loan words. A lot of these were from English, and this was just directly adopting terms from other languages. For example, government is turned into gavama, which is a direct adoption of the English word. Now I'd like to get a bit deeper into my findings and interpretation. So at this preliminary stage, I don't have all the terms yet, so I'm unable to draw any certain conclusions. However, through my observations, I definitely have seen some dominant strategies that emerged. So definitely lexicalization, which was creating a new term from native Inuktitut affixes and native Inuktitut roots to kind of reflect a meaning of the original term that was from English, or this terminology item was used pretty often, and semantic borrowing was also used pretty often. So in this case, we had native Inuktitut terms that took on some new meanings to be able to be applied to other terms in the creation of new terminology. So this seems to show that there is the prioritization of native elements, native Inuktitut elements, for example, native Inuktitut roots and affixes and terms in the creation of this new terminology, which seems to reflect somewhat of a perspective of linguistic purism, where they want to preserve this Inuktitut heritage and identity, essentially the purity of the language, by taking these native elements when creating new terms to reflect this modernization in society and to close this gap in domain vocabulary. However, we also were able to observe some borrowing used for certain terms. This seemed to reflect its usage in community settings, as all these terms which had an Inuktitut equivalent, which did turn out to be borrowing. So this means that the language planners deliberately used the borrowed English term or borrowed term from another language for the Inuktitut term that was being created. All these loanwords seem to already have been established or documented within the Inuktitut language. So in this case, they were essentially taking a term that was already existing within community usage of the Inuktitut language. So this term was already used in community settings, and then they took this term and used it within terminology development because it was already established as an Inuktitut word, even though it did not originate directly from Inuktitut in through its etymology. So this seems to show somewhat of a tension between the institutional ideology of linguistic purism, as we can see how lexicalization and semantic borrowing, so essentially native terms, native affixes, and roots are being prioritized within this process. However, we can also see this interplay between this more of a purist ideology with community use, as we see, especially within the bilingual context, language context, and within the bilingual situation within these Inuktitut communities, there are lots of documented loanwords that are already being used in the community on the ground in reality, and these terms are also being implemented within this language, within this terminology development process. So to further help us understand these linguistic dynamics at play, we revisit the Stubney and Jernud's language management theory. So this model, as a theoretical model, framework for analysis, helps us see terminology development as an ongoing cycle of observation, evaluation, and adjustment at multiple levels. So essentially what this theory proposes is that at the micro level, we have simple management. So essentially the adjustments of speakers that they make in their daily life. For example, when Inuktitut speakers, Inuktitut communities naturally start using a borrowed word, for example, gabama for government, then that's simple management in action. It is decentralized, it's more of a response to immediate communication needs on the ground. And then we have at the macro level, where we have organized management, which involves conscious language planning by institutions. So this is something we see here in terminology development, where we have this organization, such as the Inuit Language Authority, that is publishing official glossaries of of terminology that they are explicitly developing. So this is organized management, which is attempting to steer language development. So this theory recognizes how we have a feedback loop between this micro and macro level. This organized management of the language authority within language planning doesn't just occur within a simple vacuum, as they must conform also to the realities of simple management. So, for example, when standardized terms aren't being adopted in daily speech, planners have to adjust their policies or risk creating terminology that essentially only occurs on paper. So this is essentially what is being proposed by the language management theory, and we can see this manifest in this situation we see throughout this study as we have this institutional ideology on this macro level that is being proposed, which seems to be more of linguistic purism, and we can see this reflected through the majority of the terminology that is being developed through this language planning process. However, we do see that they are responding to community practices, to actual language practices on the ground when they are taking loanwords, for example, which don't necessarily fit into their ideology of language purity, of linguistic purity. However, they are still incorporating these loanwords within, which have foreign influences within the language planning process, as they know that these loanwords have already been established. They are already being used by the community, so that incorporating these loanwords into the language planning process and into this terminology development will actually help speakers be able to use these new developed terms, like how the usage is being observed in the community on the ground. So as a conclusion, throughout this study, it has emerged that terminology creation seems to navigate the intersection of institutional standardization as well as community-based language use. So it's not just the institution that is proposing a certain view or just the community that is proposing a certain view. In fact, these two aspects are playing together in order to create this terminology development. And also, Contact-driven variation is shaped from both prescriptive and descriptive approaches to language planning. We see these prescriptive approaches, for example, when these language planners are creating language glossaries with terms that they have been developing through workshops. And we also see these descriptive approaches when these language planners are also taking into account what is really happening in the community, how this language is used, how, for example, loan words, borrowings are being used in the community, and they incorporate this into the language planning process. Okay, these are my references, and thank you so much for listening to my presentation.